Welcome to this deep dive. It's going to be all about mangroves.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at this source you gave me, the Code of Practice for Sustainable Use of Mangrove Ecosystems for Aquaculture in Southeast Asia.
Awesome.
So hopefully by the end, you'll know a lot more about how we can make aquaculture and these really amazing ecosystems, work well together.
Yeah, mangroves are often really misunderstood. Like, people think they're just trees in the water.
Okay, I'm ready to be wowed. Like, what makes them so unique?
Well, think of them like the guardians of the coast.
Yeah.
I mean, they protect the shoreline from erosion and from storms. They have all kinds of unique plants and animals,
Yeah.
and they provide food and fuel and building materials for communities that live on the coast.
I did hear that some countries have lost a crazy amount of their mangroves, something like 50 to 80% over just 50 years.
Yeah, that's right. It's pretty shocking.
It is shocking. Why should I care? As someone who doesn't even live near a coast, why should I care about mangroves disappearing?
Well, healthy mangroves, they benefit everyone, even if you live really far from the coast.
Okay.
They support fisheries. They provide a nursery ground for all these commercially important species.
Mm-hmm.
They help fight climate change by storing huge amounts of carbon, and they protect coastal communities from storms and rising sea levels, and all that affects us,
Yeah, it's like we've just totally taken these amazing ecosystems for granted.
Yeah.
Our source material talks about how people used to think that mangroves were perfect for aquaculture,
Right.
especially in Southeast Asia. And I love some of the terms that they use, like tambak or punang
Mhm.
or palaisdan, to describe these traditional fish ponds.
Yeah, mangroves were historically seen as like the perfect place for aquaculture.
Yeah.
I mean, they're cheap, they're accessible, and the tides naturally flush them out.
Yeah.
But then, modern aquaculture practices kind of created some challenges.
Yeah, our source talks about how digging deeper ponds and all that excavation can hurt mangrove health. The excavation can expose acidic soil, and then mangroves need more water exchange than the tides can provide.
Exactly.
So it seems like there's this really delicate balance.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and that's where this code of practice comes in.
Yeah.
It's not about banning aquaculture completely, but more about finding a way for aquaculture and mangroves to live together.
Right. That makes sense. I never thought about mangroves like seawalls before, but the source says that a dike with mangroves will last like 50 years,
Wow.
but without them, it only lasts like 5.
That's crazy.
That's a crazy comparison.
Yeah, it really shows you how powerful they are for protection.
Yeah.
They're like a buffer against waves and storm surges, even tsunamis,
Yeah.
which can really reduce damage to coastal communities and infrastructure.
So this code of practice is kind of like a set of guidelines to make sure that we're not harming these natural seawalls.
Exactly. Code promotes responsible aquaculture practices that don't hurt the environment as much. And it also really focuses on sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
So making sure that we don't, use up all the mangroves for short-term gains.
Right.
And it talks about the need for enforcement to make sure that people are following these guidelines.
So it's about striking a balance.
Exactly.
Let's dig into some specifics from the code.
Okay.
Articles 1 and 2 talk about how valuable mangroves are, even beyond just the things that we can see and touch.
Yeah.
And there's this study from Thailand that found that intact mangroves are worth like 70% more than shrimp farms.
Wow.
So basically, you're getting way more for your money by protecting mangroves than by converting them.
Yeah, it's a really good argument for conservation.
Yeah.
It challenges the traditional economic views that often underestimate how much nature contributes.
Right.
It's not just about making a quick profit, but about thinking about the long-term benefits of a healthy ecosystem.
That Thai study is fascinating, but how do we get policymakers to think about the long-term value of mangroves instead of just like short-term profits?
That's a really good question. It often takes a combination of scientific evidence and economic arguments, and just making the public more aware.
Right.
The more we understand and appreciate the value of mangroves, the better we can advocate for their protection.
Yeah, the code also talks about small-scale integrated aquaculture systems that can actually work with mangroves.
Right.
And they describe this really cool Empayat farm design from Indonesia.
Yeah, Emping Parrot is a great example of how you can integrate aquaculture with mangroves in a sustainable way.
Okay.
It's like a donut-shaped pond where they plant mangroves in the center hole and then fish swim in the outer ring.
Okay.
And that creates a mini ecosystem where the mangroves give habitat and filter the water while also benefiting from the nutrients in the pond.
So it's like a win-win for the mangroves and the aquaculture operation.
Exactly. It's a symbiotic relationship that shows how we can do sustainable aquaculture that supports mangroves instead of hurting them.
That gives me hope.
Yeah.
But I know there are still challenges. Articles 17 and 18 talk about introducing exotic species, specifically the South American shrimp Penaeus vanami.
Yeah.
Could this shrimp be a problem for Southeast Asian mangroves?
Well, introducing any exotic species always has some risk because it can upset the balance of the ecosystem.
Right.
Penaeus vanami is a really fast-growing and disease-resistant species, so it's become really popular for aquaculture.
Okay.
But there are concerns that it could outcompete native shrimp species.
Yeah.
And that could impact the food web and mangrove health.
It's a reminder that even when we have good intentions, we need to be careful about the unintended consequences of our actions.
Right.
Especially when it comes to introducing species that don't belong there naturally.
It's all about understanding how complex an ecosystem is and making smart decisions that minimize risks,
Yeah, the code also really stresses that rehabilitating mangroves is about more than just planting trees.
Absolutely.
Article 19 tells this really inspiring story about the Calibo Mangrove Reforestation Project in the Philippines.
Yeah, the Calibo Project is a great example of how community involvement and a holistic approach can lead to success in mangrove rehabilitation.
Okay.
They really focused on restoring the natural tidal flow because they knew it was super important for a healthy mangrove ecosystem.
Yeah.
And, their efforts turned a degraded area back into a thriving mangrove forest.
It's a reminder that nature is incredibly resilient if we give it a chance.
Yeah.
And even in places that have been changed a lot, restoration is possible if we plan carefully, involve the community, and stay committed for the long term.
Absolutely. The Calibo Project shows that we should work with nature, not against it.
Right.
By understanding how the ecology works, we can come up with effective strategies for restoring and protecting these variable ecosystems.
That's a great transition into what we're going to talk about next. We've talked a lot about the challenges and opportunities of aquaculture in mangrove ecosystems.
Yeah.
So what does all this mean for our listener? How can they be a part of the solution even if they're not a shrimp farmer or mangrove conservationist? So let's explore that in part 2 of our deep dive.
There's actually a lot you can do even if you're far away from mangroves.
Okay.
The first thing is just becoming aware, understanding how important mangroves are and how the choices we make as consumers can impact them.
So even though I don't live near a mangrove forest, the stuff I buy and the food I eat can have an impact.
Exactly. Think about it. If people keep demanding unsustainable shrimp farming practices and that leads to mangrove destruction, then what we choose to buy has a ripple effect.
Right.
Being informed, asking questions like, where does my seafood come from? Or is it sourced sustainably? That can really make a difference.
Yeah, those are good questions to keep in mind. Are there any certifications or labels that consumers should look for? Something that tells you a product supports mangrove conservation.
Absolutely. Supporting sustainable aquaculture practices. That's another really important action. You could look for labels that show the product comes from responsible farming. Ones that prioritize mangrove conservation and don't use harmful chemicals. There are a bunch of organizations that are working on certification programs.
Yeah.
So doing a little research on which ones are reputable can be helpful.
I've also been thinking about maybe just eating less seafood in general, or even trying plant-based alternatives. Would that help too?
Every little bit helps. Reducing your seafood consumption or trying plant-based options can definitely lower the demand for unsustainable fishing and aquaculture practices. And beyond just our individual choices, we can also advocate for policies that protect mangroves and support sustainable aquaculture.
Okay.
We can support organizations that are doing great work to conserve these ecosystems.
So it's like a multi-pronged approach, making smart choices as consumers, using our voices to advocate for change, and supporting those organizations working on the ground.
It's all about realizing that we're all connected, from the food we eat to the health of the planet. Even small actions can have a big impact.
While reading the Code of Practice, was there anything that surprised you?
One thing that really stood out was the part about introducing exotic species for aquaculture.
Okay.
The code recognizes that there might be some economic benefits, but it also stresses that we need really strict rules to stop those species from escaping into the wild.
Yeah.
Because they could really disrupt the native ecosystems. So it's like this balancing act.
Right.
How do we weigh economic development against ecological conservation?
It's like a classic dilemma. How do we balance feeding a growing population with protecting these fragile ecosystems?
It's a complex challenge. We have to find ways to produce more food sustainably.
Right.
And realize that healthy ecosystems are crucial for long-term food security.
That reminds me of something else from the code.
Yeah,
The part about resolving conflicts between different stakeholders. You know, mangroves are important for so many groups.
right.
People involved in aquaculture, fishing, tourism, and of course the coastal communities that
Yeah.
depend on them. So how do we make sure that everyone's needs are considered?
That's a really important point.
Mhm.
The code really emphasizes the need for open communication and making decisions together,
Yeah.
including all the stakeholders,
Mhm.
local communities, government agencies, the aquaculture industry, everyone.
Yeah.
It even mentions developing compensation schemes to address any negative effects aquaculture might have on some communities.
The idea of a compensation scheme is really interesting. Is that something that's already happening in some places? It would be fascinating to see how it works in practice.
There are a few pilot projects testing it out in different parts of the world, but it's still early.
Okay.
The hard part is creating a system that's fair and transparent and actually benefits the communities that are affected.
It really highlights the need for a more equitable way to manage mangroves.
Right.
Realizing that different groups value and need these ecosystems in different ways.
Exactly.
Can't have one group winning while others lose out.
You're absolutely right. It's about finding solutions that work for both people and the planet. And it requires a shift in mindset.
Yeah.
We have to stop thinking of mangroves as just a resource to be exploited
Yeah.
and start understanding them as valuable partners in our efforts to create a sustainable future.
Speaking of the future, the code mentions this thing called the Global Mangrove Database and Information System, or GLOMIS. Can you tell us more about that? It sounds pretty interesting.
GLOMIS is an awesome initiative. It's basically this global network that connects scientists, governments, and coastal communities
Okay.
so they can share knowledge and work together on mangrove conservation and management. It's like this huge library of information and a really powerful tool for coordinating global efforts to protect these ecosystems.
I love the idea of a global community of people who are passionate about mangroves.
Yeah.
So for our listeners who are feeling inspired and want to take action, what are some specific things they can do besides supporting sustainable seafood choices? Are there any organizations they can support, anything they can do on a local level, even if they don't live near the coast?
Absolutely. There are tons of international and regional organizations dedicated to mangrove conservation and research.
Right.
Like the Mangrove Action Project, they focus on community-based mangrove restoration and sustainable management practices.
Okay.
And then there's Oceana. They work all over the world to protect oceans, including mangrove habitats, through research policy advocacy and public awareness campaigns.
Those sound like great organizations to check out, but what if someone wants to get involved closer to home?
Even if you're far from the coast, you can still make a difference. You could look for local environmental groups or community initiatives that are working on related issues like water quality or climate change.
Okay.
You can also support businesses that are committed to sustainable practices and advocate for responsible policies in your own community.
It's amazing how these issues are all connected. What we do in one area can have ripple effects everywhere.
Right.
Now, as we head into the final part of our deep dive, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the future of mangroves. What are your hopes and concerns as we look ahead?
It does feel like we're at like a turning point.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
have the knowledge and the tools to protect mangroves, but there are also these huge challenges.
Right.
On the one hand, it's really encouraging to see more and more people realizing how important mangroves are.
Yeah.
More people are understanding that they're crucial not just for biodiversity, but for climate resilience and for people's well-being too. That's a big step in the right direction.
It's like we're finally seeing them, not just as something to exploit, but as valuable allies.
Exactly. That change in mindset is so important.
Hmm.
But at the same time, we can't ignore the threats that are still out there.
Right.
Climate change is already affecting mangroves all over the world with rising sea levels and more intense storms.
Yeah.
And then there's the constantly growing demand for seafood, which puts pressure on aquaculture to produce more, sometimes at the expense of the environment.
It's that classic dilemma again. How do we feed a growing population while also protecting the natural systems that keep us alive?
It's a tough question with no easy answers. We need to find ways to produce food more sustainably and efficiently.
Yeah.
We need to reduce food waste and explore different sources of protein. And, of course, we need to protect and restore the mangrove ecosystems we already have. Every single one matters.
You were talking earlier about making informed choices as consumers.
Right.
And the Code of Practice mentions product labeling for mangrove-friendly aquaculture.
Yeah.
Do you think that could help empower consumers and change the industry?
Product labeling and certification could definitely play a part, but it's not a perfect solution.
Okay.
There are some real challenges, like how do we even define and check what mangrove-friendly actually means.
Right.
The standards have to be strict and transparent, and we need a system for monitoring and enforcement that we can trust.
It sounds like there's a chance for greenwashing, where companies make claims about being sustainable that aren't really true.
That's a valid concern. Consumers need to be able to trust those labels. Yeah. Which means having independent verification and criteria that are clear and easy to understand.
Right.
But it's also important to remember that labels are just one part of the solution.
Okay.
They can help us make informed decisions, but they don't fix the bigger systemic problems that cause unsustainable practices in the first place.
So labels can be a good tool, but we shouldn't think of them as the only solution.
Right.
We need to think bigger about changing policies, changing consumer behavior, and finding new ways to balance the needs of people and the planet.
Exactly. It's about creating a system where doing things sustainably is just the normal way of doing business.
Right.
And that needs everyone to work together: governments, businesses, communities, and individuals.
It sounds like there's no single solution. It's going to take a combination of approaches that are specific to different regions and situations.
That's right. What works in one place might not work somewhere else. We need to be flexible and innovative, always learning and adapting our strategies based on the best science and the needs of local communities.
This deep dive has been an incredible journey. We've explored the fascinating world of mangroves, learned about the challenges and opportunities of sustainable aquaculture, and talked about all the ways people can help create a better future for these vital ecosystems. So as we wrap up, is there any final thought you want to leave with our listeners?
I would just encourage your listeners to remember that even small actions can make a difference.
Yeah.
Every time you make an informed choice, every conversation you have about mangrove conservation, every effort you make to support sustainable practices, it all adds up to a bigger movement for positive change. Never underestimate your power to make a difference.
That's a really powerful message to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned a lot about these incredible ecosystems and that you're feeling hopeful about the future. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.